Lying in the heart of a scenic wilderness, this lake became the centre of a stormy debate.
In the name of progress, they'll destroy every beautiful thing we've got.
A nature reserve about to be sacrificed in the name of industrial progress.
If we don't stop here, it's not going to stop anywhere. They're just going to be able to go on and on and on. You've got to take a stand somewhere.
Lake Manapouri became the focus for the biggest environmental battle in New Zealand's history. The values associated with Manapouri had always been those of a scenic reserve, but in a world of pressing economic reality, it represented a potential for hydroelectric power. The debate over the proper use of natural resources ran for more than a decade between the people and the government of New Zealand. Until the late 50s, Manapouri hadn't been seriously thought of as a power resource. Post-war prosperity had allowed New Zealand to feel comfortable in its dependence on farming as the cornerstone of the economy. Only 20 years ago, but the world was a different place. Old-fashioned enough not to be unduly concerned about the supply and cost of energy. But New Zealand's place in the trading world was changing. And in 1958, a massive balance of payments problem pointed out the weakness of our agricultural-based economy. Not surprisingly, industrialization became a fervent political catch-cry. The government needed to attract foreign investment to develop industry, and it was thought that this could be done through the offer of a cheap potential power resource. Manapouri, then, became a marketable commodity.
It came to my knowledge that Comalco, then the Commonwealth Engineering Company, was investigating sources in Papua and in Australia, and I got in touch with them to see if there would be a possibility of their coming to New Zealand, having in mind the Manapouri Te Anau resources.
It seemed that Comalco could have the generating capacity it needed by raising the level of Lake Manapouri. But this fact, above all else, would provoke wide-scale opposition. Lake Manapouri and neighbouring Lake Te Anau are situated in Fiordland, a scenic area of great beauty, set aside in perpetuity for the enjoyment of New Zealanders under its national park status. And there were individuals prepared to fight to preserve that status.
We did not oppose the use of the waters of the lake for industry. We're not happy about it, but we wouldn't oppose it because we recognized that the economy of the country was quite important. So long as they could use the waters of the lake without destroying the lake itself, we were told that we didn't need to worry about Manapouri because no agreement would be signed with the Consolidated Zinc Company until all concerned had had an opportunity of expressing their opinions. With that, we, of course, were reasonably satisfied, believing that this would be the case. 19th of January 1960. The Evening Post on the same day carried a notification or the information that the agreement had been signed with the Consolidated Zinc Company during that day. Now, this to us was a very, very regrettable thing. It was quite illegal. It broke the National Parks Act 1952. They had signed an agreement which they had no legal right to sign.
The essence of the 1960 agreement between the company and the government was that the government invited the company to come to New Zealand to investigate the feasibility of their using the Manapouri Te Anau lake system resources for the purpose of developing electrical energy, with the object of setting up a large smelter.
The agreement would allow Comelco exclusive rights for 99 years to use the waters of Manapouri to service an aluminium smelter requiring continuous power even during dry periods. Such a requirement made it necessary to raise and manipulate the lake levels. The only restriction in the agreement was that Te Anau township should not be flooded.
When we learned what was in that agreement, it was a damnable thing, and no other words will describe it, because Lake Manapouri and Lake Te Anau had been sold to the Consolidated Zinc Company.
I think in fairness to the government, and indeed in fairness to both sides, it should be said that the National Parks Authority was fully consulted in this matter.
The National Park Authority knew no more about it than we did, although it was their park. In view of that fact, we asked in a petition which was signed by between 25 and 30,000 citizens that the agreement should not be validated.
The agreement was validated by an act brought down by the Labour government. It was passed unanimously in Parliament. To a depressed economy, the scheme promised great returns.
Our power resources represent very big business.
This is the greatest single development ever envisaged in New Zealand.
The total overseas exchange earned may well amount to £40 million annually.
When the scheme is developed, the raised lake will be an even more beautiful scenic resort than it is today.
I can well visualise the merging of one of New Zealand's finest panoramas in harmony with one of the greatest engineering achievements of mankind.
Government's enthusiasm remained undaunted, even when 2 years later, Comelco failed to raise part of the finance.
Under the 1960 Act, Comelco had to carry out quite a lot of investigation work and spend a certain amount of money by the end of 1962. Before the end of 1962, it became clear to Comelco that they would not be able to raise the finance to build Manapouri, the smelter, and all the projects they were planning in Queensland. They approached government and said that they didn't think they would be able to take up the option given them under the 1960 Act. Government offered to build the power station, meet all the costs of it. The company were to pay a price for energy which was equivalent to what it would have cost them if they'd built the power station themselves, and so they obtained a guaranteed long-term source of electricity at a cheap rate from a single source, that is Manapouri Power Station.
The new national government was prepared to pay the cost of renegotiation rather than lose the deal altogether. Some of the cost would be offset by a percentage of power, surplus to Comelco's present needs, being available to the national grid. But in the general optimism, a few voices of caution were heard.
How difficult it is to understand the legal jargon and complexity of this measure.
The clause about preservation of the lake's beauty seems calculated to give the appearance of obligation without reality.
There is such a wide variation as to the amount of power that could be developed. More definite evidence should be obtained.
For the government to commit the people of New Zealand to an agreement, the implications of which are not known even to the government, is negligent treatment of our heritage.
We organised a new petition, and this new petition asked that all the facts should be made public. All the facts concerning the agreement, the information should be made public.
Although the Select Committee gave the petition its highest recommendation, it fared no better than the first. The voice of protest was drowned in the clamour of progress. Construction on the Manapouri project had begun. Lake Manapouri was not the only environmental issue in those years. There had been a concerned response to the Aratiatia Rapids project, as well as other power schemes. Tourist promotion interests and conservationists had discussed grievances at a scenery preservation conference. The government responded to increased concern by setting up a Nature Conservation Council. The recommendations of this advisory body did nothing to allay fears over Manapouri.
The council as a whole agreed to oppose the proposals to raise Lake Manapouri on scientific and environmental grounds, and we agreed as a council to avoid taking any part in arguments along economic grounds, although the council did suggest to the government that an economic appraisal should be made. This we regarded as something which was necessary in the public interest. Over the years, we made repeated requests to the government for scientific research to be undertaken by such bodies as the Geological Survey, the Botanical Division, DSIR, and so on, but for a long time without any avail at all. At that time, which was 1959-1960, engineering works being performed in New Zealand were so destructive of the environment. The power stations were simply built and scarred landscape, and nothing was done to tidy them up or beautify them afterwards. Our ideas on conservation were really primitive compared with other parts of the world.
Despite the Nature Conservation Council's plea, full scientific and economic appraisals of the Manapouri scheme remained undone. The project was nearing completion, with the erection of a transmission line to the smelter at Bluff. It seemed nothing would stop the eventual raising of Lake Manapouri. However, as the line came out of the closed mountain valleys and carved its way through the southland forests into the open, it crossed paths with the man who was to focus public opposition.
I hadn't been involved in environmental affairs before, but the Manapouri area was particularly beloved to me. Now, the thought that it was going to be flooded and destroyed was very hard to take indeed, unless there was a reason so pressing that there was no other option. But of course there was no such circumstance. There was a great deal of misleading propaganda put across by politicians. So we called about 10 people, and we called them together in Norman Jones, the present MP's house. And after argument for a couple of hours, we came to the conclusion that as far as we could gather on the tiny bit of information we had, that the whole business was much of a disaster as far as New Zealand was concerned. And a committee was set up. We called ourselves the Save Manapouri Campaign Committee.
Lake Manapouri, a mere 17 miles from Manapouri, was the nightmare behind Maclean's opposition. The lake had been raised only 7 feet 50 years before, and no attempt had been made at shoreline clearing. Conservationists were able to use Manapouri to arouse public feeling over Manapouri.
Mr. Holyoake, who was then Mr. Holyoake, claimed all the time that I was making an emotional issue out of it, and I reminded him that a little emotion now and then over things that really mattered was not necessarily a bad thing.
In early 1970, Maclean left Southland to take the Save Manapouri campaign on a national tour. Fourteen committees were set up throughout New Zealand in response to the crusade. The public were now demanding to take responsibility for the fate of the lake.
Why are you taking part in this march?
Well, the simple reason I think that the Manapouri setup is quite wrong, and I wouldn't like to face my children in the future and say that I haven't done anything to prevent this happening.
The real question still remained. Could Manapouri be raised without serious environmental damage? In 1966, the Minister of Electricity decided that to raise Manapouri to the same level as Te Anau, some 80 feet, was impracticable. Investigation indicated that 27 feet was more likely. This was cold comfort for conservationists.
This is Broad's Bay on the shores of Lake Te Anau, and it's one of the very many beautiful bays and beaches of these two lakes that we are so anxious to protect. And also, it's a very good place to illustrate quite graphically what would have happened if, as the engineers had proposed, they raised the lake level by 27 feet. All the bush at the side here of the beach would, of course, have been inundated and destroyed. But even if the level had only been raised by a matter of 1 foot, it also would have inundated the root systems of these trees, which are geared to exist on the average level of the lake, and the end result of just that 1 foot of raise would have meant destruction for the forest.
In 1967, the Ministry of Works and Invercargill were asked to prepare a report and estimate for clearing bush around the shores of Lake Manapouri when it was intended at that stage to raise the level of the lake some 20-odd feet. To our knowledge, there had been no similar scheme done anywhere else in New Zealand or similar type of work, so that we asked that a pilot scheme be allowed to take place in the south arm of Manapouri to allow us to determine costs, methods of disposal, and various means in which we could achieve agreeable form of clearance.
A relatively flat area at South Arm was chosen, and experimental clearing was undertaken over 2 acres. Some attempt was also made to clear bush on steep rock faces along the foreshore. In such areas, access was not always easy. It seemed that the best method of disposal was to sink the timber in the lake. Tests found that no timber remained floating after 5 days. The Ministry of Works felt that the scheme proved that clearing could be carried out to acceptable standards, but conservationists were unhappy with the results.
The South Arm project of clearing was a complete failure, a complete disaster. The Ministry of Works estimated that they could do it on the 2 lakes for a sum of 7 million. The conservationists said 15 million, but in the event it proved both had hopelessly underestimated. One of the biggest problems, of course, was the disposal of the debris. We tried sinking it in the lake. Some of the trees floated, some of them sunk as they had all been intended to do, and the result, of course, was a disaster area not only on the shore where the clearing was, but also in the lake itself.
The public concern at possible damage to Manapouri was growing. A nationwide petition was organised to demonstrate to the government the strength of environmental feeling.
We were tremendously encouraged by the support and the type of support that we got. There were the 4 principal religions, the National Council of Women, all the universities, the Medical Association, and many more professional and other bodies that indicated that they supported us in principle.
The tide of public protest had been built and sustained on emotion.
The windows of Parliament are open right now and they'll hear you. Do we want to protect our national...
But the conservationists now needed access to the hard information they charged had been kept from them.
I think we were well aware of the charges of secrecy made by the various groups. I don't think they were justified. There may have been a period prior to the passing of the 1960 Act when commercial negotiations were going on that information was scarce, but from the time of the passing of the 1960 Act, the full information was available.
An enormous credibility crisis had arisen because for a number of years, up to the time the Commission was announced, various ministers have been saying that no decision about Manapouri had yet been made, and that it was still open to the government to make a decision about it.
I don't think there was ever any statements made by ministers to the effect that government was not bound by the Act to raise the level of Lake Manapouri. because that was well understood, I think, by all concerned.
Whatever the facts of the matter, the people were determined to make their voice heard. In March 1970, the largest petition ever mounted to that date was presented to Parliament. Over 250,000 signatures demanded that Lake Manapouri should not be raised above its natural level. A war of words resounded in newspapers throughout the country during the first few months in 1970, and there was growing pressure for some sort of public inquiry. There was still a need to resolve conflicting views on lake raising. Would it cause temporary or permanent scenic damage? Government finally bowed to public pressure. A commission of inquiry was set up. The terms of reference for the commission did not please everyone. The value of energy resources had increased worldwide as a result of the recent oil crisis. Comelco was receiving cheap power at an inflation-free cost. This became increasingly irksome in the economic climate of the 70s.
The main public emphasis of the campaign was the scenic values. Now, I'm not particularly that way inclined myself. I don't really see anything wrong with developing resources, providing the development is going to be properly appraised, cost-benefit analysis done, and the New Zealand public told exactly what is going on and how much will accrue to the economy. Of course, that didn't happen with Manapouri in any way. The cost-benefit analysis was prevented, in effect, by the government when it drew its terms of reference up for the commission. And I was one of a number who were refused the right to discuss the cost-benefit analysis of Manapouri at any stage. The original estimates of what this was going to mean to New Zealand as far as monetary return started off at something like $100 million and finally settled at a paltry sum of $14 million per annum. Now, on that, placing that sum on one side and asking what was being given in return, we had, first of all, an investment of $200 million of New Zealanders' money. Secondly, we had pledged the second largest river in New Zealand to the scheme. And thirdly, we had pledged the total generating capacity of New Zealand's largest lake system. And in return for that, we got $14 million a year, which, of course, isn't really a reasonable interest rate return on the $200 million, let alone any payment at all for those two other vast resources.
Even without hearing the dissenting views on the economics of the deal, the Commission were faced with a weighty task. Its members visited the area prior to the hearings. And in June 1970, the Commission began listening to submissions from both sides.
The submissions of the Electricity Department to the Manapouri Commission of Inquiry claimed that government had contractual obligation to Comelco to maximise the output of electricity from Manapouri, and this meant raising the lake to a limit dictated by good engineering and hydrological practices, and after study this was shown to be a maximum raising of 37 feet.
Government's obligations in developing the water resources were determined by the key phrase in the agreement, good engineering and hydrological practices. Where we differed from the Crown was that we said that in considering good hydrological practices, you had to consider the impact on the lakeshore environment of alteration and manipulation of the lake levels. And when one came to consider what was good engineering practices, then one had to consider the economic aspect of what was contemplated and to work out what, in the end, was the cheapest thing to do.
Electricity Department submissions rested on the guarantee of the 1963 Act that the necessary power would come from Manapouri only. In any case, Comelco was unwilling to accept energy from an alternative source for fear of being charged with receiving subsidised power. The conservationists argued that Comelco had no real cause for complaint if the shortfall was made up from a source other than Manapouri. And they argued that there was some doubt as to whether Comelco's needs could be fully supplied even if the lake was raised.
A raised lake would have given Comalco the ability to run on full power the smelter for practically 100% of the time. And it was the fact that under the terms of the agreement, however, that in a particularly dry year, if the smelter could not continue on full load, then that would have been Comalco's responsibility to take care of, not the Crown.
We thought Comalco's complaint about the prospect of having to take more expensive power from elsewhere a little bit academic, because it was conceded that even with the lake raised to 610 feet, Comalco's entitlement would only be able to be met from the Manapouri water 99% of the time. So in any event, there was some beefing up that was going to have to come from somewhere. Now, with the lake unraised, it was conceded that Comalco's entitlement would be able to be met 97% of the time, so there's that difference of 2%.
The whole furor then was over an extra few percent of power. But it was not the Commission's task to comment on such irony. In its findings, the Commission recognised that some irreparable damage would be done if the lake was raised. For instance, certain islands would be submerged. But otherwise, it felt that, in the long term, the scenic appearance could be restored to an acceptable standard. At the same time, it found that the Crown was legally bound to raise the lake. The Save Manapouri movement seemed to have lost the final round, but a new element was about to appear. So far, all the arguments had raged around Manapouri. Te Anau rested in the assurance of the Act that the township would not be flooded, but the Manapouri debate prompted a more detailed investigation by Te Anau residents.
I was interested in the effect on Te Anau, and the Act showed that Te Anau was indeed under considerable threat. With a fair amount of effort and research, we found that the lake was to be controlled at a high level of 6 feet over its natural recorded maximum and a level of 6 feet below its natural recorded minimum. Now, these levels were not catered for in the original Act. They emerged from a technical conference of New Zealand representatives and Comalco representatives in Te Anau in 1960, and they were not part of the original legislation. In other words, they were illegal. The levels set for the lake would have involved flooding in the township and would have exposed areas of mudflat up to about a quarter of a mile offshore.
There were no precise surveys. The levels were levels which had been found by aneroid barometer, and the reference in the agreement is to a level of water in the lake as indicated by a wooden pole. There is reference to 20 feet on the lake gauge. It was necessary to translate this into more precise figures, but the agreement was drafted without waiting for this to be done.
A considerable amount of investigation was carried out on the areas of the township, and it was found that the operating level as proposed for Lake Te Anau would have no detrimental effect on any private property in the township. But some remedial work was proposed for the eventuality of a 500-year type flood.
We knew by the figures that regardless of what the original Act had said, Te Anau was, could well be flooded and would be, and that it would be controlled to well below its natural minimum. The problem then was to convince the local people and demonstrate to them what was in store for them, and their sort of reactions varied from disbelief to anger as the impact settled in.
The anger in Te Anau was being heard elsewhere. as frustration with the Commission's findings brought a new radical element to the fore. Politicians were now asked to explain their stand.
There are so many questions being asked on your placard that frankly I couldn't answer them all. And that is offhand. The major one, the largest one on the banner that is here, I see asks a question. Who owns this country? The New Zealand people or Comalco? I have no hesitation in answering without equivocation or hesitation. The answer is the people of New Zealand.
Real answers were not going to come from taking to the streets, but at last action had begun on the scientific front.
We were very concerned initially that there were no environmental studies of the lake shore, no attempt to understand the impact of the lake raising on the natural system of the lakes and the lake shore. There'd been one or two superficial studies done by DSIR scientists, Ecology Division and Botany Division. They were mainly aimed at just assessing what the losses were, documenting the things that were there that would be flooded. And it wasn't really until towards the end of 1969 that we were invited by DSIR through money from Electricity Department to make a study of the Manapouri-Te Anau shoreline to try and assess the impact of lake raising.
It's necessary to bear in mind here, I think also that there wasn't a great deal of basic homework, or rather basic work on the actual surrounding environment. That had never really been done, and that's, I think, was fairly common with a lot of places in New Zealand.
It was quite clear to us that it was a very complex pattern of vegetation, and nowhere near as simple as the engineers saw it, so that with lake raising, no way would they have been able to restore the status quo as the engineers saw it. It would have been an almost permanent damage to that shoreline, and with the variation in lake level that they were planning, there'd be no way that that stability of the shoreline could be in any way restated.
This initial scientific study soon had conclusive support. Slumping took place on the shores of Manapouri when the Electricity Department artificially lowered the lake for the first time in August 1972. Scientists from all over New Zealand were brought in to assess the problem. It was just 3 months before the election.
It brought a lot of attention and concern to the area, and of course it heightened the political debate at the time. But from a scientific point of view, it just showed how very vulnerable those lake shores were to manipulating the lake levels outside their natural ranges.
Manapouri begged for political attention, but Te Anau finally demanded it.
The town was covered in protest banners. The rest of the country took no notice at all. The Ministry of Works, meanwhile, were digging a very large hole over there in which the present control structure sits, and which they insisted to the end was merely an exploratory hole. As it cost $250,000, we doubted it. And then in early 1970 we had the bomb scare, which to us was a bit of a joke, and certainly did not start with us. But following the bomb scare, all of a sudden the media was hanging on every word that came from Te Anau. Within 2 weeks of the bomb scare, the Prime Minister was to come and hear our story. Because it was election year, the leader of the opposition then had to come, as the Prime Minister had, and as they had, all the other politicians came too, although our arguments had not changed at all.
The 1972 election was looming. Now Manapouri was a vote-catching issue, and social credit were first to exploit it.
National and Labour parties. In actual fact, they have fought over whose idea it was. But now, ladies and gentlemen, the focus of the public spotlight has been brought to bear upon this whole unfortunate, and I say grubby, secret deal.
been in office 9 years. There's now a controversy. Somebody went up to the Prime Minister and said, hey, mate, you better come out of chloroform. There's a row going on. What will we do? There is no agreement on earth that cannot be changed, providing the government of the day is prepared to pay the cost of changing that agreement.
Norman Kirk honoured his pledge not to raise Manapouri. The Save Manapouri campaign had been able to generate a real public concern for the protection of the environment. And in a positive step, the new government called upon 6 of the most outspoken critics on the issue to form a unique group, the Lake Guardians. The critics were now asked to offer practical solutions for safeguarding the delicate shorelines. Wide-ranging powers were afforded them to action their recommendations.
The 6 Guardians were chosen from among those who really led the campaign. I've called them the cream of the rebels, which I think is a fair assessment. And the terms of reference we were given were very wide. They were to advise government on operating the lakes so as to ensure the environmental and recreational features of both lakes, Manapouri and Te Anau, were retained. There was no mention of the hydroelectric potential of the lake. That wasn't a matter for us to consider, although clearly it was important. And also we were to be given free access to any official information that we thought was important to us.
In our early dealings with the NZED, or dealings right through with the atmosphere was one of trust, I think, cordiality and trust. We asked for information, we got it, and we had to make the thing work because we felt that the eyes of New Zealand were upon us, and perhaps all future problems of this nature would be judged on what we did at Manapouri.
The Guardians' terms of reference were pretty clearly laid down. They gave them a very responsible job. In fact, they really put them in quite a warm seat. So we did have a certain amount of sympathy with them.
In a necessary spirit of cooperation between engineers and conservationists, a workable compromise was achieved. Complex guidelines were drawn up for the lake's operating levels. These were based on 37 years of records of the lake's natural rise and fall. Under the guidelines, 93% of the water resources are utilised. The Electricity Department does its best to operate within the guidelines set, although abnormal conditions may force some temporary deviation. In such circumstances, informal discussion with the Guardians ensures minimal disturbance to the critical balance. The restraints under which the Electricity Department are now operating are helping to maintain the shoreline's fragile stability, and are allowing restoration of beaches previously damaged.
These 2 photographs were taken in January 1974 here at Stockyard Cove, when we had a problem of the lake being held at near its minimum level for long periods at a time while the Mararoa Dam was being built. And the problem here was that the wave action combed the gravel down off the beaches and left what is beneath them here, this rather puggy material, just showing how thin these gravels are. And of course this pug is a recreational problem, and it's an aesthetic problem, I think, as the photographs show. And we've seen quite a considerable recovery of the beach since 1974, I think largely because the guidelines of and the lake has been operated at a higher level. And there's been some restoration of the gravel over the beaches, but it's still pretty thin.
Te Anau is the venue for regular Lake Guardians meetings, attended also by representatives from the Electricity Department. Now that the guidelines have received official sanction, the Guardians wish to embody their principle in legislation. If this can be achieved, the Guardians will happily hand over their role to a proper authority.
I think the last important remaining aspect for us to consider is this question of legislation. Particularly the need to get an amendment of the clauses in the Manapouri Te Anau Development Act that relate to lake raising. And of course it's those aspects that we've made our submission to the Minister for the Environment through the Commission for the Environment, with the supporting statements from the Fiordland National Park Board and the Southland Catchment Board.
Yes, well, I see our options are, we carry on as we are with being re-elected in perpetuity every 2 years. The guidelines have been accepted by the government. They'll be quite happy to go along with that.
At the moment, there's the Te Anau Manapouri Development Act, which still gives them the right to raise the lake. Well, they can't have it both ways. There's no way they're going to raise the lake as long as they continue the guardians and accept the present guidelines. So I see no purpose in them not revoking that legislation.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you know, New Zealand Electricity has accepted the guidelines as we negotiated as guidelines, not as in violent rules. And if the guardians are successful in achieving statutory recognition, then the body that has this responsibility of looking after the Act will have the same cooperation in the future as the guardians have had from us in the past.
If some resolution has been achieved, this is because the two sides in the controversy have at least learnt to understand each other's language.
Things started moving in a positive way when both sides started to appreciate the values and the problems of the other. In particular, when the guardians appreciated that New Zealand Electricity had great problems in operating a power system, that management of lakes like Manapouri and Te Anau was a complex matter, and that placing restrictions on this operation made it even more difficult. New Zealand Electricity, on its part, had to learn to appreciate the environmental values that the guardians were concerned about.
Basically, I think the whole experiment or an experience has been a wonderful yet experience for the whole of New Zealand, and it's shown the way for future problems of this kind. It's shown that ordinary people that step out of civilian life do have a very great knowledge of their country, and a knowledge that in many cases the engineers do not have.
As a result of the lake not being raised, Manapouri is not fulfilling to the full extent for which it was designed. But having regard to the changes that have taken place in public opinion over the years, I think that what we've finished up with is a good, sensible compromise.
Man, in effect, still has the ability to make a very considerable mess of these shorelines. And what we have is a situation where we depend totally on sort of long-term goodwill by the party that's most concerned in controlling the lakes, and that's the electricity department. And in fact, it will have to take a continuing pride in its efforts here, because a major error or a lack of commitment at any time may cause damage which may last forever in our terms anyway.
It's been a very successful compromise. We've preserved the quality of the lakes, and at the same time we've got a very substantial quantity of power. But the situation is such that the public must continue to have a watchdog role and be very careful to see that things don't go too far before they make their opinions known.
Manapouri then has ended in a satisfactory compromise, but it is also part of a continuing and wider story. If conservation is seen as the wise use of resources, proper appraisal is now more critical than ever. In a world increasingly hungry, the pressure to develop natural resources for energy and other purposes will soon be unprecedented. Perhaps the real battles have hardly begun.